Good morning, everyone. Am I audible? Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the two-day international conference on theorizing anti-casteism, organized by the Department of English, Presidency University, Kolkata. I am Bhushan Ray. I am a student of undergraduate level at the university, at the English department. So this is parallel session number 2, titled Life Writings of Dalit, Adivasi and Bahujan Women. This session is being chaired by Dr. Nandini Saha. Dr. Nandini Saha is Professor, Department of English, Jadavpur University, West Bengal. Her areas of specialization are postmodernist translation studies, Bengali Dalit literature. She has published articles in journals and also has chapters in edited volumes. She has been teaching at the university level in Bengal for more than 25 years. Over to you, ma'am.
So very good morning to everybody. Do we have all the paper presenters yet? Because the names in the schedule says Dr. Reshmi S, who I think has joined.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes. Reshmi,
Yes,
can
ma'am.
please switch on your
Pawar
video
presenters
for
also.
a few. Yes. Dr. Dhrupadi Chattopadhyay has joined. Dr. Reshmi has joined. Dr. Pritam Singh has joined. So we have the first three presenters here, but we still don't have Dr. Anum Fatima, right? Dr. Dhrupadi, Dr. Reshmi, Dr. Pritam, could I please request you to switch on your video for a few minutes? I think because this is going to be recorded, we need to have everyone's, we need to record everyone's presence, yes? Thank you. The coordinators of this session, can we start or should we need to wait for Dr. Anum Fatima? That's Dr. Dhrupadi. There's a problem with your mic, so, okay. Yes, we will need to, yes, okay. We will need to hear you speak, so yes. Please fix the problem with your mic. Meghumala, will you please ask Mohitosh whether we can start the session because otherwise we'll run short of time at the end. Yes? Yes, okay. We will need to hear you. One of the organizers, please. Meghumala, can you hear me? We can start. Okay. So Dr. Reshmi, we'll start with you. So very good morning to all once again. And as you know, the title of our session is Life Writings of Dalit, Adivasi and Bahujan Women. So we will be talking about life writings by women. Because I just have a very brief introduction of all of you here. So I'll mention what I see in the schedule. Dr. Reshmi S. is an assistant professor of English from Thrissur, Kerala. Welcome, Dr. Reshmi S. And if you could please introduce yourselves properly. Yes, I just don't have the whole thing here. And you will have 20 minutes. Each of the presenters will have 20 minutes for presentation. And then we can have some time for question and answer at the end. Yes. So also to the listeners and whoever joins us, if you have any questions, you could type them in the chat box. Yes, we'll take it later. Reshmi, would you want to start? Yes, it's 11:50. So you need to finish by 10 minutes past 12. Yes?
Okay, ma'am. Am I audible, ma'am?
Yes, yes, absolutely.
Okay. So good morning. Welcome to my presentation, respected chair of the day, Dr. Nandini Saha, madam, then faculties of Presidency University, Kolkata, the organizers, paper presenters and participants. Welcome to my session. And yes, my paper is titled as Representing Caste and Gender Underpinnings of the Adivasis, Journey from Subjugation to Resistance in Mother Forest. So here, all through this paper, I will be looking into two distinguishing variables. One is caste and the other is gender, which are remarkable distinguishing traits that separates or segregates the indigenous people or the so-called Adivasis and from the non-indigenous people, that is the mainstream society. So how this caste and gender, how they become the crucial factors in determining the lives of Adivasis and the consequences of these determining variables. And in particularly, I will be tracing the work titled Mother Forest. This is actually a life writing or a memoir written by or that traces the life story of C.K. Janu. She's a famous tribal activist from Kerala, and actually she's not the author of this work. She has recorded her observations and experiences to a person named Bhaskaran, and Bhaskaran has written these life writings in Malayalam language, and later it has been translated into English by Ravi Shankar, by a man named Ravi Shankar. So this is actually the self-reflections of this tribal activist who moves from an ordinary tribal girl and how she empowers herself and reaches to the level of an activist. So this Mother Forest really traces this an ordinary woman's journey. It's not, there is nothing like an extraordinary or supernatural in the case of C.K. Janu. Even without any background of formal education, she becomes the spokesperson of the tribal literature or the tribal narrating from South India, and gradually her fame moves from South India to the entire part of India and even across the continent as such. So at the outset, I must say that this literature, the writings of the Adivasis can be classified under different headings like literature of the marginalized, especially when it unveils the hidden layers of their indomitable past, then unrevealed experiences and situations. And the second, they can also be placed under Dalit literature. And the third one is the tribal writings. So whatever be the case, whether it is the literature of the marginalized or tribal writings or Dalit literature, the common thing or the common thread that brings all the writings of the Adivasis is that they experience intense humiliation. And this is what these writers always try to focus through their writings. They experience alienation, isolation, fragmentation, exploitation, discrimination, in the name of caste, in the name right from their birth onwards. So the impact of globalized economy, along with the different strategies in the name of development, like industrialization, the building of dams and the tourist centers. So whatever be the thing, the positive, the progressive aspects or the negative aspects like deforestation. So whichever be the thing, yes, the impact has been completely experienced by these so-called Adivasis. So the instances of injustice is something that always affect and matter the life of the Adivasis. And it is in this context that I think that my paper becomes very crucial in bringing out the hidden documents, the hidden life agenda of the tribal people, the so-called Adivasis from a place called Wayanad in Kerala. Wayanad is situated in the northern most part of Kerala, and this place is densely populated with these Adivasis. So let us explore in detail what are the different aspects that C.K. Janu, the tribal activist, bring us or take the readers to. The caste, yes, Caste, just like gender, caste is also, as I said earlier, a distinguishing factor. And the Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact has declared casteism to be a form of racism. Yes, obviously, it is a kind of racism that always segregates the people. And I quote the wordings of Balmurli Natarajan. He takes caste to be neither simply an intellectual puzzle nor existential fact, but desires its demise as a fundamental social, political, and ethical problem of our times. Yes, truly, we must agree to his statement when he makes such a very interesting observation that it is high time that we must see the demise of caste system. It creates a lot of troubles to the social lives of these tribal people, and it is a deeply ingrained social practice. And further, I borrow the quote of Rendal, who has observed it is a set of casteism is a set of monopolization strategies based upon domination, stigmatization, exploitation, exclusion, or annihilation on the fact of caste. And Janu's mother forest is a kind of rewriting. It's a kind of resistance. This is the platform where she has taken it to resist her or to express her voice in such a way that she can voice against the existent ideologies, the hegemonies that determine the hegemonic operation of these Adivasis. And the Adivasis, as we all know, they are the geographically and culturally isolated and the scattered group who occupy the inner regions of the forest. They are actually afraid of these so-called civilized people. Civilization and modernization are always hated by these Adivasis. And whenever they see the outsiders encroaching into the forest, they have a tendency to hide themselves into the forest, deep into the forest. Yes, they have some aversion to this civilization, or they are stereotyped as insiders of the forest. So they have, because of this aspect, they have the reluctance to accept modernity, civilization, change. But it doesn't mean that they should be marginalized on account of their primitiveness, on account of their civilization. They too have a rich civilization which is very much attached to the pristine environment of the nature, the forest. But still, their lands are confiscated. As we all know, their lands are confiscated, and one fine morning they have become landless. They have become homeless. They have even become strangers and trespassers in their own habitual areas. So this is the fate of the Adivasis that Janu is trying to. She herself, being a tribal woman, she records these experiences from her own life instances. And minority rights group sees Adivasis as I quote, marginalized, indigenous, ethnic, religious, and linguistic communities, often without power, whose rights must be a concern of all communities, both in India and internationally. So, prior to British colonization, Adivasi areas were actually independent regions, but the abundance of natural resources allured the colonizers to occupy their lands by converting them into a so-called class like bonded laborers. Uh, the practice of slavery system began with the British invasion. That is how we must trace their history. And further, the Forest Act of 1864 empowered the British government to declare any land covered with trees, bushwood, or jungle as governmental forest by notification. And in no time, the true inhabitants become illegal encroachers and occupants. So the resistance of the Adivasis continue even today, not only against the colonial exploitation. It actually started with the resistance started against the colonial experience in the beginning, but it continues even in the post-independence era. Not only in the pre-independent, but as well as it continues in the post-independence era, despite the implementation of various constitutional provisions or legal provisions. So the displacement of Adivasis thus triggered poverty, stagnation, unemployment, and even deaths. So nowadays, government has started. It's not nowadays. They have started this agenda of positive discrimination. That is, reservation of seats for these tribal people in education, in the employment sector, then in the political sector. So this agenda of positive discrimination has been enforced by the Indian constitution to a great extent, but still it fails miserably when it comes to the real practice, when it comes to meet their ends. That is how Janu says in this life story. And when we move on to the contemporary feminism, yes, can Janu be called as a feminist? Yes, she never adheres to the rights of not only the Adivasi women, but she sees the Adivasi people as a collective. And in that sense, we cannot call her as a feminist alone. She stands for she becomes the welfare activist for the entire tribal people. So in that sense, yes, but one of her agendas in dealing with the lives of the Adivasis is, of course, the empowerment of the tribal women. And most of the works, as we know, written in the background of the tribal studies, they romanticizes the plight of the Adivasis without giving any practicality or without giving any practical adherences to its different sides. But this C.K. Janu's Mother Forest is really an attempt to represent the Adivasi politics to this translated text actually centers around the landlessness as well as the oppression of the Adivasis to a greater extent. Here again we must discuss about Balmudli Natarajan, who has clearly stated in his essay From Jati to Samaj, two important, he has contributed two literary terms. One is cultural or differentialist casteism, and he says that yes, cultural casteism or differential casteism, both casteism can be connected, one with the history and with other with the contemporary society. That is, this particular casteism also gives rise to heterophobia as well as heterophilia. Heterophobia casteism means the casteism that is grounded on discrimination, apartheid system, economic exploitation. All modes of exploitation can be associated with this heterophobia casteism. Whereas when we move from heterophobia to heterophilia casteism, we can see the process of othering or difference. And that is what we see in the contemporary society. We always have a tendency to dislocate or to position these Adivasis as others. And this is the contemporary discourse of casteism, othering or creating differences. And C.K. Janu, she is from the Adia community, a community named Adia community, and she has no formal background of education, and still she became, it's not on a fine day that she became the leader of the Tribal Activist Association. Yes, she has opportunity, she has an opportunity to attend the literacy campaign that took place in her village. Initially, she shunned away from those literacy campaigns, fearing that the outsiders will exploit them. But gradually, when through her sister, she realized that yes, they have given them a lot of books, story books, right from the story books, coloring books, and she gradually she began to expand her world of knowledge. She opened very soon she realized that the education opened the doors of knowledge before people, especially to the Adivasi women. And in this context, I would like to quote another theoretician, Shailaja Paik, who said in her famous book, Dalit Women's Education in Modern India, she highlighted the varied forms of discrimination met out by the Dalit women. And like Paik, Janu also emphasized how education is necessary in the life of a tribal woman. So Janu's standpoint is that education coupled with agitation and community mobilization should only empower or liberate the tribal women from the stereotypical representations. And to pay the identity of Dalit women was not weighed down only by their caste but also by gender. So this text, Mother Forest, it opens with a blatant comment that Adivasis have been pushed to the interiors of the wastelands. Yes, and the text discusses in detail the interconnectedness, the harmonious relationship of the Adivasis with the nature, environment, and the forest. Then the Adivasis' first encounter with the world outside the forest, then sense of alienation, then Janu's journey from an ordinary tribal woman to a social activist, then later how she becomes a torchbearer to the entire Adivasi community. And further, the text also explores the unspoiled relation of the Adivasis who live in close agreement with the ecosystem. I quote a sentence from the Mother Forest. She says, Janu says, "No one knows the forest like we do. The forest is mother to us, more than a mother because she never abandons us." Yes, this here comes the significance of the title, Mother Forest. Yes, these people, they see view forest as their mother, and mother, as you know, the relation between mother and children. Yes, it is it is an what we cannot limit our definition, or we cannot what give it a clear structure for this definition. It is something that can be destructured, deconstructed to its infinite ways and possibilities. And further, Jana also mentions about the existence of jinmis or landlords. How they began to exercise indomitable influence upon the Adivasis. And Janu notes that one thing that remains constant even after marriage or passing of generation is the slavery system. The helplessness of the tribals is acutely provided by Janu, that how they get meager wages for the works being carried out in the fields, and how the backs of the people used to be so bent because they were so terrified, and this fear of this terror of fear continues for generations. And even when our people speak, they don't raise their eyes, and that must be because they are so scared. She also reminiscences. Man and woman stay together, they have children, the parents go to Jinmi for the work, the children graze his cattle. That's all there is. Frightened of the Jinmi and scared of others, they live on with bowed heads till they slowly turn old. Yes, the passing of years is something, such things never matters for them. All throughout their lives, they have to work for these Jinmis. And what they get in return, small measure of paddy substituted for the wages, and they have to work for longer hours, and their health becomes very weak, degenerated. And this is how the practice of slavery is being implemented by the local landlords. And this practice, first she mentions about the British, the colonizers, then next she mentions about, Janu mentions about these the local landlords or Jinmis, and the third important group of people that she makes a reference to is the migrants. Yes, the migrants, they are still worse in their approach to these Adivasis. These Adivasis, as we know, they do not have the practice of keeping records of their lands and the other properties, and soon the migrants, they started to encroach upon their land. They offered some small meager amount of money, and they confiscated their lands all of a sudden. And what happens to these Adivasis is they suddenly become homeless. And she
You have
laments,
2 more minutes to go, Reshmi.
okay, okay, ma'am. So, and further, she also mentions about the sexual exploitation of women and girls who have been who have been plundered in the name of civilization, development, and status. And why not? The northern district of Kerala is a place that has seen many land struggles and crimes against Adivasi women folk, including rise in the female single parents, false promises of marriage, then rape, kidnapping, disappearance of women. And Janu notes that our community can surely grow only through the togetherness of women. Adivasi men easily fall to money and liquor, and restrain from work and family responsibilities, and become the performers of domestic violence as well. And she says, in our case, unity in everything emerges from our women. Women have something in common, and this in the 2001 as well as in the 2003, she becomes the leader of two regional struggles waged against the government of Kerala. And we could not say that she has succeeded in these two struggles, but still she tried to represent her community, and that to a woman for the first time from her community against the government. And the social exclusion of Adivasis from all realms of life continues in various extents in the post-colonial era. And Adivasis, they were situated within the highly politicized context of economic and social conflict. And to my conclusion, I can say that the anti-casteism always rejects casteism as a vital principle of the current Indian society and advocates the need for anti-caste politics to work through identity and solidarity. And Mother Forest chronicles the realistic saga of an independent and self-supportive woman who feel the impulse of empowerment and spread the same to her fellow members. And she also urges her community to keep the flame of consciousness alive and ignite for collective solidarity. The tribal woman turned into a committed social activist, Janu, fits into the framework of an organic intellectual, the term coined by Antonio Gramsci, as she keeps on working towards the collective upliftment of her community. That's all about my presentation. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Reshmi. So I think we'll move to the second presentation. And if you have any questions for Dr. Reshmi, you can type it in the chat box, and we will take up all the questions at the end of the presentations. And I also don't see the fourth presenter. Mohitosh, if you could clarify and just find out, I don't think she's here yet, Dr. Anum Fatima. So Dr. Pritam Singh, we will request you to switch on your video. Your presentation is next. Dr. Pritam Singh, who is the assistant professor. Sorry. Yes, Dr. Pritam Singh, who's an assistant professor, SNMT Government Girls College from Jhunjhunu, Rajasthan, right? So it's over to you, Dr. Pritam, and if you would want to introduce yourself properly again.
Good morning, ma'am, and thanks for the invitation. I'm Dr. Pritam Singh. I'm working at State Netra Madras Trivandrum Government Girls College, Jhunjhunu, Rajasthan. The
And
title
you
of
have
my
20
paper.
minutes, Dr. Pritam, yes? Please time yourself.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The title of my paper is Craving for Identity, Subaltern Anguish in the Regions We Broke. It's an autobiography by Debbie Comley. The word subaltern may be applied to any person or group that is powerless, dominated, underprivileged, disadvantaged, and inferior to other dominant or powerful groups. A subaltern is thus anyone who is not holding a rank politically, socially, economically, and intellectually. They are subalterns because they hold a lower position in a hierarchy of command and dominance. In this way, subalterns constitute a larger population than allied in any paradigm of power and command. A subaltern group may constitute peasants, workers, children, female, tribes, or minority of any kind who are denied the hegemonic power and are subjected to it. This concept was originally coined by Italian Marxist scholar Antonio Gramsci. He has coined this term in relation to the army specifically. Later on, with the journal titled Subaltern Studies Writings on South Asian History and Society, which was edited by Ranjit Guha from 1970s. It has 6 volumes in continuation. The term subalternity has got a momentum and the studies begin. And according to these studies, the term subaltern has been used as a general attribute of subordination in South Asian studies to address the issues of class, caste, gender, religion, age, and office. By this definition, the subaltern in the Indian society are Dalit, Bahujans, women, and minorities. Subalternity is subordination, inferiority, exploitation, hegemony by the superior on the inferior, which become inevitable in the present capitalist society. Social operation is a concept that describes a relationship between groups or categories of people in which a dominant group benefits from the systematic abuse, exploitation, and injustice directed towards a subordinate group. It is widely accepted that Dalits have been oppressed for centuries. They are there are several instances and descriptions of atrocities against Dalits. The word Dalit originally emerged from the Sanskrit root word dal, which means broken, cut into pieces, oppressed. Dalit literature emerged into the forefront as a prominent voice after 1960, starting with the Marathi language, and soon it appeared in languages like Hindi, Kannada, Telugu, and Tamil also. Dalit literature in its initial stages was identified as specific protest directed against everyday humiliations that individual Dalits and Dalits as a community face. Dalit literature cannot be reduced to an engagement with victimhood. Dalit literature has spawned new literary canons by disturbing the usual language available in the pre-existing canonical literary circles. Dalit literature today has established itself as a new mode of literary aesthetic imagination and writing. I quote Arjun Dangle that Dalit literature is one which acquaints people with the caste system and untouchability in India, and also its appalling nature and its system of exploitation. In other words, Dalit is not a caste but a realization and is related to the experiences, joys, and sorrows and struggles of those in the lowest stratum of society. Dalit means masses exploited and oppressed economically, socially, culturally in the name of religion and other factors. Dalit writers hope that this exploited group of people will bring about a revolution in this country. I would also like to quote Sasi Bhushan Upadhyay from representing the underdogs Dalits in the literature of Premchand. He said that Dalit literature is not a literary movement in ordinary sense of the term. It is like black literature, a product of an identity as well as constitutive of that identity. Dalit literature, therefore, is not the literature written by anybody on the Dalits, but only by those who are by birth Dalits. Anyone else who not born as a Dalit, even though writing on the socially downtrodden with sympathy or empathy, cannot be considered as a Dalit writer, nor will his or her literature be taken as Dalit literature. So here, my paper is on one of the important Dalit women writer who sets the milestone of change in the history of Dalit literature is Baby Kamble. Her autobiographical narrative, Jina Amucha, which was originally written in Marathi and was being translated into English by Maya Pandit under the title The Prisons We Broke, deals with the whole community, Mahar in general. In this biography, Baby Kamble has tried to narrate or represent the kind of suffering, the kind of pain, the kind of anguish which her society in general has faced, the discrimination, untouchability, subjugation of women, abject poverty, and the influence of Dr. Ambedkar on that community through which they have regained their identity, they have uh, realized their dreams, and they have tried for all these things. Like most autobiographies, Kamble begins her autobiography with a brief introduction of her family, but very soon there are only a few, two or three chapters in which we found any reference to her personal life. She has moved on to her community, and in this regard, Maya Pandit, the translator, asserts that Kamble's book is more of a socio-biography rather than an autobiography. Kamble has the sole purpose behind writing this book, and that is to bring forth the suffering and anguish of her community. She says in her interview with Maya Pandit, I quote, "Anyway, for me, the suffering of my community has always been more important than my own individual suffering. I have identified myself completely with my people, and therefore, Jina Amucha was the autobiography of my entire community." In line with this motto, the 12 chapters of the book keenly portray the real face of Mahar community. Kamble does not focus on any single character and its development. Instead, her book is a manifesto of her community. Kamble demonstrates how caste and religion converge to perpetuate exploitative practices against Dalits. She portrays the superstitious customs and rituals of her community in a very detailed manner, in which she talks about the possessed women. I would elaborate this thing that she has devoted the whole three chapters nearly, in which she shows that how the women of this community they become possessed by some deity, by some god or by some goddesses, and then they cry and then they wail and then they dance and then they do all those tantrums and they are pacified ultimately when they were being offered some offering by the elderly men of the society. The rituals in the month of Asad, again, the whole month they have those rituals related with their deities, with their gods, and again, those every day they have those possessed women to see in every other house of their society. The distribution of dead animals place. Whenever an animal dies in some upper caste house, then that dead animal is brought to the Mahar society. They cut it into pieces, and then those pieces were being distributed according to the status of the Mahar families. The death of someone in the upper class. Now, this again she narrates in a very pathetic thing. She tells that whenever someone dies in the upper caste family, then it is the duty of the Mahar to inform to the relatives of the dead person. They have to go on feet. They just reach there, even running barefoot. And when they reach there, when they give that unpleasant news to the relatives, then they are being beaten. And the relatives, they soon start to the deceased house on carts or on in any other option available. But the Mahar, he has to come back again barefoot and has to do all the duties again, which was supposed to be done in that upper caste family house. All these events are deeply rooted in the psyche of the Mahar community and they perform them to their utmost. She realizes that these customs are also means of enslavement for her community, devised and imposed on them by religion of the upper caste people. She says, I quote, the entire community had sunk deep in the mire of such dreadful superstitions. The upper castes had never allowed this lowly caste of ours to acquire knowledge. Generations after generations, our people rotted and perished by following such a superstitious way of life, yet we kept believing in your religion and serving you faithfully. She narrates the poverty and harsh living conditions of the people very elaborately. She says that often there is a lack of food in nearly every house of Maharwada. People remain totally hungry for 3 to 4 days continuously, and ultimately, when they didn't find anything to eat, then they even go and collect the cactus flowers. And she has narrated it in a very uh, realistic manner that how hard it is to collect those cactus flowers through those cactus thorns, and then when they eat those cactus flowers, the hunger which is gnawing them from inside that is satiated. But then the next day they have to suffer again because of those cactus flowers because they could not absolute themselves of those flowers. They just stick there in their intestine and they have to suffer for 3 or 4 days and then fever overtakes the children and even children die because of those cactus flowers. And she very pathetically narrates the living conditions of her community and categorically blames the classes for this conditions. He says that such was the condition of our people. We were just like animals, but without tails. We would be called human only because we had 2 legs instead of 4. Otherwise, there was no difference between us and the animals. But how had we been reduced to this bestial state? Who was responsible? Who else but people of the high caste? The conditions of women are far worse. Small girls are married off and they give birth to children at a very tender age and face the various pains in their houses. Kambale narrates the condition of these mothers who are just given birth to their newborn babies in a very pathetic manner. She narrates that there is no food in the house, and these mothers, they need soft food, but even hard, even stale food is not available for these mothers. She says, I quote, labor pains, mishandling by the midwife, wounds inflicted by onlookers' nails, ever gnawing hunger, infected wounds with pus oozing out of them, hot water baths, hot coals, profuse sweating, everything which is being given to that new mother, it causes the new mother's condition to worsen, and she end up getting a very high fever. She points out some very paradoxical things which these people have to face and endure in their daily walk of life. One such thing is the daily begging round of the Yaskar Mahar, the head Mahar of the community, through the high caste streets. He was prohibited to make any sound from his mouth as it might pollute the high caste people, but the same Mahar and his family do the cleaning of their household and supply woods for their cooking. She narrates, I quote, the Yaskar Mahar had to carry with him a stick fitted at one end with a small bell. The reason for this was simple. If the man sitting down for their dinner heard the Mahar's voice, they would have to discard their meal and get up. But if they heard just the sound of his bell, they could finish their meal. His voice could pollute, but not the sound of his bell. Another very paradoxical behavior she narrates of the high caste shopkeeper, that whenever some Mahar woman goes to buy something from his shop, it is very necessary to maintain a distance even for small children who might accompany her accidentally. The shopkeeper would come out and from a distance throw the things into her pallav, which she had spread out in order to receive them. She would then respectfully keep her money on the threshold. That, of course, did not pollute him. Again, the biggest hypocrite in narrate is the Brahmin priest. I quote, a Brahmin priest would be invited to solemnize the marriage. He would stand at a distance for fear of pollution, but he would never make any compromise for his dakshina that he took away without any fear of pollution. Another incident he narrates is that these Mahar women, they uh, had to cut the woods from the forest and they had to supply them to the upper caste families' houses. But they had to maintain, they had to keep a very strong vigil, and they had to uh, thoroughly investigate that bundle of sticks, that no hair strand would be there of the low caste women so that it might not pollute their kitchen. The
You have
living
5 more minutes, Pritam.
okay, the living conditions of these Mahar community, they were very low, they were very pathetic, they were very painful, and she has narrated it in a very elaborated manner. And she has also elaborated that how, with the advent of Dr. Bhimrao Ambedkar, they have realized their identity and they have tried to regain that identity. And though it was not easy for them, even when Ambedkar has tried to explain this thing, uh, the resistance which they have given is this, that how can we give up eating dead animals? If we do this, then how can we call ourselves as Mahas? This is how the uh, upper caste society has ingrained those customs, those caste foundations on them, that they don't even realize that they are being downtrodden. They are being used by them for their own purposes. Though with the advent of Ambedkar, they started going to schools. They have those Mahila mandals. They have formed their own armies to fight for their rights, and slowly and slowly they have regained their true identity. So we see that in spite of being an autobiography, the Prisons We Broke is the documentation of the struggles and springs of a whole community. As she has stated in her interview with the translator, Kamble has truly presented the life and history of her community. The book brings to the forefront the experiential worlds as well as discursive practices that have rarely been discussed in mainstream literature. It reveals the diverse ways in which the resistance, selfhood, and subjectivity of not just an individual but an entire marginalized community is constructed. So this is it. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Pritam. Uh, One thing I think I forgot to mention are the titles of your paper. So if you, when you're introducing yourselves, if you could just, though we just have one more person to go. Pritam, what was the title of your paper? I was not reading it out in case you've, decided to change the title. What was the title of your paper, Pritam?
Craving for identity, subaltern anguish in the regions we broke.
Okay. And Dr. Reshmi, so that was the title of Dr. Pritam's paper. Dr. Reshmi, what was the title of your paper? Was it the same that we have in the schedule?
Yes, ma'am. Representing caste and gender underpinnings of the Adivasis' journey from subjugation to resistance in Mother Forest.
Yes, it is the same. Thank you. Thank you, Rashmi, and thank you, Pritam. Okay, so we move to the third paper now of this session. Dr. Dhrupadi Chattopadhyay. Dhrupadi, is your title also the same? Should I read it out? Talking Difference, Weaving
Yeah,
Dissent,
talking.
Mars
Yes,
Reading
yes.
Resistance.
Yeah,
And Dhrupadi is an assistant professor and head Department of English in Mumbai, is it? Maharashtra.
yes. SNDT
Okay.
Women's University, Mumbai.
Okay, so please introduce yourself, and if you want, you can read out the title once again and begin your presentation.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for this opportunity. Today, I am going to talk on Urmila Pawar's work. And the title of my paper is Talking Difference, Weaving Dissent, Urmila Pawar's Readings of Resistance. So I had sent the full paper, but I'm also going to use a PPT. So I'll just share the screen if it's okay. I think Meghumala is the coordinator, right? Dr. Saha, is it okay if I share my screen? Just a second. Can you see my presentation?
Yes, it started. Yes.
Okay.
Yes, we can.
Um, Okay, so today we heard two presentations as part of this panel talking about various aspects of reading Dalit literature, one from Southern India and one from Western India. So my paper, or the main argument of my paper, is positioned basically against a lot of these readings that are current, that are part of university departments. And as we know that Dalit literature is in that sense, no longer outside the canon, as it were. Now it has its own canon. It is part of almost all major university departments in India and abroad. But this has led to certain problems, as I will discuss. So this has rendered reading Dalit literature as subaltern, I argue. Right. So Dalit literature announced itself in literature classrooms globally beginning in the 1990s as a literature from the margins. Right. But it has led to a paradigmatic reading of modern Dalit literature. Right. Which has been forwarded by West-led frameworks, right? So we read them in within a certain very prescriptive notion of what it means to be subaltern, right? And one of the obvious outcomes of this sort of reading is to read it against political movements that emerge out of the Dalit Panther movement. right? Which is again, as Urmila Pawar will point out, which is again usually the way that it is read, the way that it is framed, is seen as men leading the movement, followed later by women, right? And subsequently, there is a centrifugal conceptualization of Dalit literature, which begins in Marathi, apparently, right? And we have seen in the recent past, for example, we've seen a lot of very interesting research which has contested this claim that Dalit literature begins in Marathi, born out of the Dalit Panther movement, and then spreads to other parts of the country. And therefore, we attach a sort of singularity that defines this literary practice. And another problem with reading it within a certain framework, as we do, is we use frames from sociology, anthropology, and political science to understand contexts of caste, right? And we use that to read literature, thereby ignoring the literariness of this literature. It is essentially a literary movement, right? So, and therefore we look at it within a very prescriptive sort of caste gender double marginalization axis, as it were. And then it becomes part of a larger Indian Dalit literature canon, which is comprised largely of translations into English. And that has its, Rita Kothari, for instance, has a beautiful article in the Economic and Political Weekly, which talks about the politics and canonization of Dalit literature and the way that it sort of figures in syllabi across India, fueled by a certain politics of who gets translated how, why, and what kind of marketing sort of then becomes representative of the literature. Now, if we look at this prescriptive framework, and there are obvious problems with these frameworks that we usually employ to read the literature in classrooms, the literature, the way that it is being taught, it is being read, right? And one of the major problems is in the way that Dalit aesthetics, for instance, defines itself. So if you look at the self sort of theorization of Dalit aesthetics, you see that Dalit aesthetics, or the way that it has been conceptualized as part of the Dalit literary movement, actually contests all the frameworks that I outlined just now, that we are sort of familiar with.
Dhrupadi, if I just may stop you for a second here, we are stuck with your first slide. Are you still on your first slide?
No, I have moved.
But we can see only the first slide now. We can see the title of your paper, that slide. So I think you need to share.
Now can you see it?
Yes, but yeah, I think what you need to do is go to the slideshow and from the beginning or from the current slide. And
yeah, I actually started the slideshow and then it sort of froze. So I'm just going to, if it's okay, if I can just, point out the slides like this, is that fine?
Yeah, yes. Yes, thank you.
Okay, I think I finished with this slide and I've moved to this. So if we look at the conceptualization of Dalit most famously, Limbale says that literature's aim is not to please, right? So the idea is to puncture this Savarna notion of literature and literary pleasure, right? So that is the first form of resistance. And in the introduction to the translation of Baburao Babul's text, Shanta Gokhale talks about three very important markers of Dalit literature or Dalit aesthetics, where she talks about Vidroha, revolt, Vedana, pain, and Nakar, dissent, right? And K. Sachidananda again sort of elaborates on this idea, and he talks about how Dalit literature represents a certain rustic culturally corrupt and obscene aesthetics, right? As a mode of resistance against Savarna frameworks. And it questions rules like Dwani, suggestion, and Auchitya or propriety. So reading, looking at Dalit aesthetics and positioning them against the sort of very acceptable, comforting frameworks that we have, there are at least two or three positions which emerge out of it. And one of them is this idea or this notion of difference. So in the early 1990s, Gopal Guru published this very, very influential article, which then went on to become a very major debate in Dalit literary studies, where he talked about Dalit women talk differently. And he then moved on to theorize this notion of difference, right? And I'm going to just quickly sort of read that. So this dissent, or this understanding of difference, as he says, brings forth three things. One, it is not only caste and class identity, but also one's gender positioning that decides the validity of an event. And Dalit men are reproducing the same mechanisms against their women, which their high caste adversaries had used to dominate them. And the experience of Dalit women shows that local resistance within the Dalit is important. And this is something that then Urmila Pawar sort of elaborates. And the whole situation compels us to defend the claim of Dalit women to talk differently. And then Sharmila Rege sort of picks up on this notion of difference and talks about Dalit women's narratives as being testimonials, right? So and these testimonials are also their protest against a communitarian control of self, right, which sort of flattens their narrative, the kind of narratives that we are familiar with, the kind of readings that we are familiar with, which flattens tensions in women's writings, where it is only seen as a communitarian control, sort of communitarian angst being represented in their writing. Right? And Laura Brueck has then sort of complicated or sort of teased layers out of this problem of testimonials, as it were, where she talks about the collective, the relational, and specifically gendered character of Dalit women's life writing without simplistically categorizing them as testimonials or witnessing. Nor should we overprivilege their gendered specificity, thereby effacing the very real narrative authority. And this is something that I'm going to elaborate. Narrative authority, purposefulness, and perspectival control of their authors. Instead, we must be especially attentive to the language of a text and understand how the relationality and collectivity of experience is not accidental or necessarily organic to a woman's view on her world, but is actively, politically, and consciously constructed in the course of a narrative, predicated on a reasonable concern over the appropriation of a revolutionary new literary voice. Attention to narrative form has been slow in the coming to the critical and scholarly analysis of the literature, somewhat paradoxically resulting in rendering of this literature too as untouchable. Right. So in this context, in this framework, where we do not talk about narrative authority, where we only talk about a certain kind of oppression, we need to probably animate this notion of difference, animate these notions of contestations within a text, and look for sources of narrative authority within the text. Now, one way of doing that is probably something that Urmila Pawar offers, right? So Urmila Pawar's autobiography is part of the canon, is very, very widely read. But as I was speaking, that her autobiography is read within very prescriptive notions of how women's autobiography, Dalit women's autobiographies should be read. Ironically, Urmila Pawar had already provided tools for reading such autobiographies, not as standalone texts, but as texts in conversation with women's political movements, with other alternative forms of articulations which are often indicated in the text but which remain silent in the text, right? So other forms, various forms of women's resistances, which are as important as the literary text or the literary tools that allow us to read autobiographies in certain terms. And she writes this very, very important book, which with Meenakshi Moon, which was written in 1989. And translated in 2008, called "We Also Made History: Women in the Ambedkarite Movement." And this text sort of challenges this notion of this, very, very linear conceptualization of the movement of Dalit literature, as I suggested, of beginning in Marathi, with the Dalit Panther movements initiated by men and then followed by women, where she sort of traces women's movement, or Dalit women's movement, active participation in politics in various forms, not just forms recognized as texts, right? And she follows it, this movement, as it were, from the 1920s to the present times, to 1989 when she's writing. So it is part ethnographic, part literary, where she excavates these sites of resistances of women which remain silent in various readings of the literature. I suggest that we use the tools that she provided in this text to then read her autobiography, right? And some of the things that she does in this particular text, along with Meenakshi Moon, is very, very interesting, because she talks to various, there are newspaper reports, there are newspaper cuttings, there are recipes, there are references to various art forms that women engage in, including basket making, which then forms the title of her autobiography, of women's collectives, of women celebrating, Haldi Kumkum together, to the Bhim Geet that women sang. Do I have the time to play a Bhim Geet? I have quoted a Bhim Geet here, very, very popular Bhim Geet, where women talk about resistance, not in terms of resistance as
You
outlined.
have another 5 minutes. So
Okay. Maybe therefore I don't have, but you can listen to it. It's a very, very popular, beautiful Bhim Geet, and I'll just read the lyrics of this Bhim Geet. Child in arms, broom in the hand, and pot of garbage on the head. My Bhim has filled my sack with gold. So imbuing it with a gendered form of resistance, as it were. So she looks at multiple registers of engagement. And this sort of figures in her autobiography. Now, if we use this to sort of read her autobiography, you will find that her autobiography is filled with these silences that require these multiple forms of engagement then to be read. So it cannot be singularly read as a closed form, right? And she, in the opening of the autobiography itself, she talks about the curses and the songs that women sing on their way to the market, and in particular the sort of language that they use, right? And the language becomes therefore a site of resistance, which then needs to be read within these, as I was trying to outline, with the kind of food that they were carrying, the kind of the kind of art forms that go in along with that, and one has to read the silences, as it were, in the text. I gave the example of a Bhim Geet, and here I am going to look at a song that Pawar and Moon quote in their book, which is very, very interesting, where look at the sort of wedding songs that women were writing. So prior to their conversion to Buddhism in 1956, the very, very famous conversion to Buddhism that was led by Ambedkar, women were singing songs that pertained, or wedding songs that were associated with Hindu gods and goddesses, in particular Lakshmi. And she says that with the coming in of Buddhism, they had to change. They had to adapt. They had to change. They had to write new songs, and these songs, interestingly, came from these sites of modernization, of this movement from the rural to the urban, and these sites of resistances that came from these objects which were new, the way that they incorporated them in the song, and the sort of narrative then that emerges out of it, right? So these the urban Dalit population who were working as scavengers, who were working as cleaners in megapolises like Mumbai, for instance, where the song is located, is very interesting how these women exploit these tropes that were there. For instance, this song is this wedding song that was composed sometime in the 1960s or 70s, is entirely based on the couple taking a train ride. Right, the Sarkar has fixed at Baikala a new iron rail on which it has started running the fire train. The bride Manju sits in a compartment at the back, and the bridegroom Jairam sits in a compartment at the front. What are you doing, Manju, in the compartment at the back? I embroider, look at the terms that she's using. I embroider my sari with a golden thread in the compartment at the back. What are you doing, Jairam, in the compartment at the front? I embroider my cap with a golden thread in the compartment at the front. So it's interesting that these new relationships that are being forged in a new religious network, where the signifying systems are altered, the signifying systems are changing. That's very interesting that these women were using these songs to compose these new relationships, as it were, to forge these new relationships using these tropes, which were on which one could then layer them with various meanings and possibilities. And you see that in this particular song, it looks like a compatible marriage, because here both the bridegroom and the bride are participating in designing their wedding trousseau. And if you read on to the song, read on further, you will see that the bride takes active role in this sort of union. And the city, therefore, becomes a very, very important trope in a lot of these narratives, and even the historical sort of context that are then provided, right? And she talks about this very hilarious incident in her autobiography, which is layered with Black humor, where the Dalit movement, literary movement, was overtaken basically by men who were then sort of taking the lead role, where women were relegated to the margins, and where she was called as a speaker, but nobody sort of paid any heed to her, as she recounts in this incident. So
I think you need to wrap up now.
Yeah, so these spaces, these new spaces, as it were being used by women from the Dalit movement to imbue it with possibilities of resistance, which are otherwise left ignored in a strictly textual tradition, and readings of resistance within the textual traditions. So I suggest that we read resistances with alternative points or markers, which can begin with conversion in 1956, women's movements of the 1970s, which Urmila, Pawar, and Meenakshi Moon outline in great detail, and the Dalit women's representations or articulations in the era of globalization, which is the second or the third generation of Dalit women writing in particularly in English. And one of the ways, I'll just wrap up just 30 seconds. And I suggest that one of the ways of doing this is to read autobiographies as open forms, which is constantly in conversation with other forms, right? And looking for locations of resistance or writings of resistance from these texts, which are in conversation with forms outside. And very importantly and very interestingly, looking as Pawar suggests, by using various registers of resistance, by using incremental and invisible sites of resistances to then be read or incorporated. Thank you for listening to me. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Dhrupadi. Because we do not have the fourth presenter, Mohitosh, can we go to the question session now then?
Yes, ma'am. Yes.
Okay. So I don't see any questions in the chat box, but if the coordinator, Meghumala, if you find any questions in the YouTube or in the chat box, let me know. But to begin with the discussion, first of all, thanks to all three of you. If you could now switch on your videos, if it isn't much of a bandwidth issue, so that we can start a conversation. Thanks to all three of you, because all three of you presented papers on though Pritam and Dhrupadi were referring to Urmila Pawar, Dr. Reshmi S. Brought a very different aspect to this discussion by mentioning Mother Forest, which is essentially C.K. Janu's documentation of her life and her community's life and her activist role. To begin the conversation, I think, as Mohitosh mentioned, Gajendran Ayathurai's keynote, which mentions the Scialism and mentions anti-casteism. To start from there, I would like to ask Dr. Reshmi S. Would you want to make any point? I think you did mention at some point about towards the end about anti-casteism and the way in which C.K. Janu's life, her role as an activist is documented. Would you like to trace or place anti-casteism in a reading of her Mother Forest at any level?
Ma'am, am I audible?
Yes, sure. We can hear you.
Okay. So when I go through this work, Mother Forest, I feel that the entire work is a site of resistance against anti-casteism. As we know that anti-casteism is a practice against the dominant hegemony or the hierarchy of caste system. So without caste system, we cannot discuss about anti-caste caste system or anti-casteism in particular. And this work pinpoints, or this work would not have been originated without the existence of the social categorization called the Adivasis. So the entire fabric of the construction of Adivasis depends on the caste system. And it is because of that social construction, the concepts of exploitation, marginalization, discrimination, and various other atrocities were were imparted in the name, all such atrocities were imparted in the name of caste system. So what I feel that this very chronicle titled Mother Forest itself brings to the forefront the various issues of caste system, and in a way she's trying to resist it. And her resistance is a daring step, a challenging and an innovative move towards anti-casteism. So these untouchables, or the in the beginning we attribute the term untouchables, then later we have different categorization in the society, and all such categorizations stem from the fact that is a caste system continues as a racism. It exists in the society as a social evil, to which the social activists like Janu and many others. So she is not the only one activist in the contemporary society. We can see the persons like Janu from the other societies, from the other part of the tribal history, located in different parts of the parts of our country. So her voice is definitely, we can place her within the spectrum of anti-casteism. She represents the voice of the Dalit women as well as Dalits in particular. So this is my observation about Mother Forest and anti-casteism, ma'am.
Okay, we have a question for you. Are Adivasis really facing caste-related issues? What are the specific degrees and modalities of their caste-based oppression?
Okay, is just like the other marginalized or the oppressed sections, Adivasis, they truly face the issues of caste system. To be specific, when it comes to the fact of education, there is actually no gender discrimination like in the other aspects, or the in other instances we used to hear that education will be imparted to the male children and it will be neglected to the female children. But in the case of Adivasis, we cannot see such differences at all. If they have never been given an exposure to the formal education until very recent decades, there is no question of girls or boys or the gender differences exist among Adivasis. They literally, no men or women from the Adivasi community were entitled to a formal education. So this instance is itself is a glaring instance of the fact that they were not allowed to given, they were not entitled to an opportunity or a privilege in an educational institution. So education, as we know, that it is the basic right of an individual, just like the other basic privileges. So until very recently, these people, they were not allowed to attend any such institutions. And further, there is another ideology behind it. The mainstream society always stereotype them as the interior people, or the insiders, the so-called insiders, who always want to find solace within the forest or within the primitive songs. And maybe because of that, and because of the practice of caste system, that these people, they were neglected education on one hand. That is a particular instance. And when we move on to the other instance, that is how they are being recruited in the lands by these landlords. They are not given adequate salary or wages. So this is a second instance how they are being discriminated. If it in the place of Adivasis, if you could see someone other belonging to any other group, maybe they might have raised their voice beforehand itself, and they might have acquired something more than the meager wage. But in the case of Adivasis, they don't know they don't know how to protest, how to propagate or their rights and privileges. They live in a world of darkness. They have been made to live in the world of darkness, and they never know nothing about their basic rights and privileges. And in an instance, Janu says always remembers how their ancestors, they never keep even record of the lands or the record of the properties they own. So it is easy for the outsiders to exploit them to a greatest extent. So all such shows that it's just because of the caste system that begins, or because of their birth into the particular caste of caste or a group called Adivasis, they suffer this incessant torture and exploitation. And when even so education, then their profession, then their access to natural resources, so everything. So when we take it to the even the political level, they have not been given enough representation in the political field. But recently the CK Janu, she has as she emerged as an tribal activist, and she even contested in the very recent Kerala election. Unfortunately she failed. She formed a party of her own. She and even she says that the party is always make false promises. Their agenda was not to uplift the Adivasis, but just to for the they need some people to show their strength, and for them they take these Adivasis as mere laborers. So when she realized that the party is not doing anything in favor of the upliftment of the Adivasis, she decides to quit the party. She forms a party of her own, and this party has no particular affiliations, and she believes that it is the strength of the tribal collectivity or solidarity. That is how we can trace some major instances of casteism.
Thank
And
you. Thank you, Dr. Reshmi. I just have one small question. It's more out of curiosity because you spoke about caste and gender also. So are there, because I'm not familiar with the Malayalam language, are there any autobiographies by male Dalit or Adivasis in Malayalam or translated into English?
I'm not so much familiar about it, ma'am. But
Okay.
of course there will be, as my one of my
Because
concerns.
as Dhrupadi was saying, that reading literature, I think one other aspect that we could look into women's autobiographies by Dalit, Adivasis, or Bahujan women is reading them side by side with the male autobiographies of that same caste or of the same community, which might help us to understand whether these autobiographies and documents by women are different from their male counterparts, which is where probably we could bring in the caste and gender aspect more. Thank you, Dr. Rashmi. Dr. Pritam, can we have you switch on your? Okay, we have Dr. Maruna Murmu, Professor Maruna Murmu from Jadavpur University. Maruna, if you would want to make some comments or put some questions for the presenters. Maruna, are you there?
Yeah, I'm listening, but I don't have any question as of now.
Okay, okay. Dr. Pritam? Dr. Pritam? Okay, we'll come back to Dr. Pritam because I have some questions for him. We'll go to Dhrupadi. So, Dr. Dhrupadi, I would beg to differ from you on several points in your paper. For one, you're talking about how Dalit literature is widely taught. It really isn't, Dhrupadi. I don't know which syllabi you are referring to when talking about widely taught. But it still needs far more inclusion in the syllabi, as I understand, by looking at the various university syllabi all over India. Mumbai, I know, yes, they do include some of the Dalit writings by Marathi from their side of the country. But in Bengal, we still don't have it widely accepted in the university or college syllabi. Not, yes. So what I can say is it's starting to get included. It's not very widely. The Rita Kothari article also that you're referring to in EPW, we are talking about the canon. We are talking about, which is why for me it's very important to question what is the canon, and who is then, because you're talking about prescriptive framework. Canon is, or canonization is, a prescriptive framework. So it is important to look at what kind of texts are getting canonized by the Dalit literature syllabi. But I don't think it's still very widely taught. And you speak about, so I'll just, okay, I think what I'll do is I'll just ask one or two of my questions and then probably go on to this question that has come in from YouTube by Priyanka Verma. So, Dhrupadi, you talk about, if I got it right from your presentation, you are saying that we need to look at, because you mentioned reading against the grain, you mentioned how you intend to go against the more popular ways of reading Dalit literature. Is that right? Is that what I got from your paper? That you were wanting
Yes,
to
yeah.
present ways in which Dalit literature should be looked at rather than how it is usually looked at or read, right? You mentioned the literariness of Dalit writing. Would you want to elaborate a little bit on that? What exactly do you mean when you mention literariness of Dalit literature?
Shall I take your questions in the order that you've posed? Okay. So the first, when I talk about the literature being, widely taught, probably in Eastern India it is not. But if you look at Pondicherry University in the south, if you look at University of Kerala in the south, if you look at Hyderabad University, several prominent, Delhi University has been teaching it for the past 15 odd years, at least since I was a student at Delhi University. JNU has been doing that. For
JNU, which department
English,
has been teaching Dalit literature?
yes. I am from JNU. My master's is from JNU.
Who teaches Dalit literature there?
Somebody has, I'll just get back to you with the syllabus.
Yes, it must have been something very recent because I'm an ex-student of JNU. JNU hasn't had a very long
JNU,
history of Dalit, teaching Dalit
5-7
literature.
years back, they have
Yes,
introduced
could be.
it, and
Yes, could be.
they are teaching it. Delhi University, since the time I was an undergraduate student, was teaching the literature not as a separate paper, but they have been teaching it, and they were in the news very recently for obvious reasons. We'll not get into the debate. Yeah, but probably not in Eastern India. And if you look at South Asian studies departments across the world, I think there is a significant presence of the literary studies there. Brandeis University, for instance, has a journal dedicated to Dalit studies. So I, probably, you can accuse me of gross generalization, but I think it could have been. It's probably a point to start, because I think
Yes, it has started. That was my point. It has started, and
it started
thankfully
in the
so. Thankfully so.
Yeah, in the 1990s, and as you would know, as you rightly said, that in Maharashtra, in all the universities in Maharashtra, it is taught. And some universities teach it as a different paper altogether. Mumbai University used to have it as an optional paper. Pune University has it as part of its syllabus. And my university has been teaching the literature for a very long time now. So I think it is it is not completely out of the fold, as it were, as it used to be probably 10 years back. But what I was trying to tell or talk about it, I have elaborated. I mean, in the presentation, I did not have the opportunity to elaborate on it completely. But as I mean, I'm very thankful that you asked this question, because you probably read a part of it as part of my paper, where I talk about how we use certain tools from anthropology, from political science, to understand what caste. We borrowed tools, including, how we probably use Sharmila Rege or Gopal Guru to read it, right? So that takes away from the literary movement that the literature is. So, for instance, the way that language becomes a very important indicator of resistance is something that is probably overshadowed by the way that we are looking at only certain descriptions, or we are looking at instances of oppression and reading them as case studies in some sense, right? Again, I mean, you can accuse me of sort of generalizing it, but probably you get the hint, right? That we are using anthropological tools, we are using ethnographical tools, we are using tools that we borrow from political science to read a movement which is essentially literary. So we are, for instance, we are not looking at the careful use of imagery and the layering of that imagery. And as I suggested, this book by Meenakshi Moon and Urmila Pawar, where there are various records of alternative allied literary forms that are intimately connected to this literary movement, right? So even women making rotis, for instance, the Bhim Geet, that is part of the conversation with the literary text, which is, as I was trying to talk about it, which is an open form. It's not necessarily a closed form the way, say, a political scientist would like to read it, right? So it is an open form. As practitioners of literary criticism, we should probably read into these conversations, we should read into these images and their rippling effects, as it were, when we look at this literary text. And also, as Laura Bruick sort of points out, also locate narrative authority, right? That is something that probably is often not done when we are looking at this literary text, that we also locate narrative authority within this text, and the sort of allied forms that then comes up. Did I miss a question, or?
No, can I just make a suggestion and stop saying that I'm accusing you? I'm not accusing you of
No, no,
anything.
no, I know.
This is just a suggestion. When you say we are borrowing from sociology, anthropology, or ethnography, let me say that literature is a very social medium, right? When you read literature, I say this in my class quite often, that when you're reading a text of literature, it always helps to understand that text better if you know the background to that text. So it means the background of the author, it means the background of when it was being written, what were the circumstances. So when you say, for example, the poem or the song, marriage song, I think you're talking about, and I'm very thankful to you for pointing it out. I wasn't aware of such songs. When you refer to this use of the railways, in that song, referring to something progressive, something that's so contemporary in the marriage song. But what is also being documented in the song is the bride, using golden thread to weave the border for her sari. And what I found interesting is the man also saying, I'm using golden thread to weave in my cap. One, the man is also weaving. So both the man and the woman are weaving. And if you look at it, Dhrupadi, these elements of what they do and this marriage song, these are all cultural elements, right? Though we are looking at a song, which is music, it's another form. Poetry, music, these are all allied forms. But what we are looking at are very cultural, it's a documentation of cultural habits, cultural ways of functioning. So these are technically anthropological, ethnological, ways of looking at a text if we regard that song as a text. So my suggestion to you would be not to segregate literature and look for literariness. Of course, what you're saying is absolutely correct. And I don't know whether you've read this book by, because you're a student, ex-student of DU, you probably already know about this book by Rajkumar, Professor Rajkumar, where he's talking about Dalit literary criticism. So he's asking us to evolve a literary criticism to read Dalit literature. So Dalit literature to be read differently. I agree with you on that. But to segregate literature and say not to borrow from sociology, anthropology, I think we are, when we are reading, if we want to read this image of weaving by the man and the woman, uh, we are reading the poetry in this song, but we are also referring to the ethnographic work of weaving, right? That you can then relate to Pawar's own, the title of her autobiography. So you are wanting to relate, to connect, but I don't think you can really do it by not wanting to borrow from, whether it's sociology. For me, to understand literature, if I have to borrow from other studies, it's absolutely fine for me. I mean, this is just a suggestion, because I wouldn't know how to read literature if I'm not able to borrow certain theories. And you know very well that uh, literary theory works in conjunction with sociological theories, anthropological theories, ethnographical theories. There are famous books by writers who, for us to read those texts, we need to, refer to other theories as well. This is just my suggestion to you.
Thank you, Professor Shah. Actually, I didn't suggest that we should not borrow, but I was suggesting otherwise. Actually, I was suggesting that an over reliance. I'm not saying that we should not borrow from ethnographic data. We should not borrow from anthropology or political science. I'm not suggesting that we propose a new critical reading of, of the literature. Quite the contrary. But I was just saying that since we are over reliant sometimes on these frameworks, it takes away from looking at, for instance, the literariness, the literary worth of a text also, right? So I was suggesting that because if you, at least that this is my experience of reading literary criticism pertaining to the literature, that there is an over reliance on these categories. And you're absolutely right that we cannot read a text out of its context. And context has become very, very important in the last 20, 30, 40 years. I was suggesting that one has to contextualize the text in relation to, as you beautifully illustrated with that particular song. That was actually the point that I was trying to make, that we have to establish these connections with allied forms, right? Be it music, be it weaving, be it making rotis, be it collective consciousness or organization that women's Dalit women's groups, for instance, engage in, and also these ritualistic practices that they alter very, very interestingly after their conversion to Buddhism, right? And as you again you have already outlined my answer or response, because we're also talking about how they use these when they migrate to the city, when and also even even objects, articles, cultural practices which are already present. Some of the new cultural practices that they invent, and the railways become very important because these are almost you can say that these are spaces which are neutral, which can then be imbued with more meanings, which because they are recent, they are available, and they use it very, very well. And also how they reinvent, alter existing cultural practices. For example, the Haldi Kumkum ritual, which is almost present, which they use as an organizational sort of tool that Meenakshi Moon talks about. So it moves from an essentially religious practice to a resistance, to a site of resistance. So that is what I was sort of suggesting, that the literary form or the literariness, it is essentially a literary movement, and one also has to probably give some credit to the literary language that this form sort of brings to us.
Yeah, thank you. There's just one quick question. Yes, Mohitosh, I remember we end at 1:30. We just have 5 more minutes. Dhrupadi, there's a question from Priyanka Verma on YouTube. I have a question for Dr. Dhrupadi. Are you suggesting that reading Dalit life narratives or life writings as testimonials is no longer valid? These writings being a witness to the collective trauma is reflected in their writings. I did not quite get the second part of the question. It's there in the chat box, Dhrupadi, if you can read it.
Yeah, I don't think that the concept of testimonials of witnessing is not valid, but I think what Laura Brueck Laura Brueck does not completely dismiss it, and I agree with her in the sense that we need to qualify what this witnessing is, what kind of locations these witnessings are from, and what kind of conversations then they can start. So collective trauma is not something that one can dismiss, but one has to read this collective trauma not in a linear sort of form, and flatten the possibilities of resistance within these representations of collective trauma, but rather animate the silences that exist within these witnessings, as it were. That is what I was trying to suggest.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Dhrupadi. I think one important thing that has come out of your paper and of our conversations with you, is that we need to be careful about the readings that we do of such literature. You can't just take it at face value. As we do for all literature, we need to look into the gaps, we need to look into the silences, which are always very, very important for all literature. I think we need to do that for just to say that it's just a documentation of the community life or of the treatment of Dalits or Adivasis in literature. That is not going to do. You need to be more careful in your readings of such literature. And though we did not find Dr. Pritam back again, I thank you. I thank all the presenters. For me personally, it was an extremely good start, and it was an extremely interesting, and we've had a wonderful conversation. So thank you for that. Mohitosh just left. Meghumala, if you would want to finish off the session. Thanks to everybody who's here, who's listening in, and also to the paper presenters. A personal thank you on behalf. Meghumala, over to you. Should I just end it? Meghumala?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, if you want to end the session.
Yes, so if nobody has any further questions, then we can end the session. Thank you so much for joining us and having this lovely session. Thank you to the presenters for presenting their paper as well. And here we go. That's the first session has ended today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks to everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Madam.
Thank you.
nobody has any further questions, then we can end the session. Thank you so much for joining us and having this lovely session. Thank you to the presenters for presenting their paper as well. And here we go. That's the first session has ended today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks
Yeah.
to everybody.
Thank you so much,
Thank you so much.
madam.
Thank
Yeah.
you.